All right. So in the interest of time, we're going to start sharp at 12:20. It's my greatest pleasure to introduce Andrea Rinaldo. He is trained as a civil engineer at the University of Padua, and he did his PhD at Purdue University. He has held many visiting professor or fellow positions at different universities at MIT, Princeton, Texas A&M, and Purdue. And Andrea has been elected as a fellow of many national academies throughout the world, in Italy, in Sweden, and here in the US, where he's a fellow at the National Academy of Engineering, at the National Academy of Sciences, and at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And the list of honors and prizes that Andrea has accumulated throughout the years is too long for me to mention in its entirety. So I'll just focus on a few highlights. The American Geophysical Union Horton Medal and Hydrology Award, the European Geophysical Union Dalton's Medal has been awarded an advanced grant from the European Research Council, and last year it was awarded with the Stockholm Prize, which is widely regarded as the highest honor in the field of water sciences. Andrea has made significant contributions to our understanding of the fractal nature of river networks, the spread of waterborne diseases through environmental reservoirs, and the critical role that hydrologic processes have in shaping ecosystems. And Andrea has been a pioneer in integrating principles from hydrology, statistical physics, and ecology, and he is regarded as one of the founding fathers of the discipline that now we call ecohydrology. On a much minor note, Andrea has also been my PhD advisor when I was at Lausanne, which is a time that I remember really, really fondly, and so it's a great pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for having the time. Andrea will need to catch a flight right after this seminar, so we're gonna end at 1:10 sharp, but you'll get the opportunity to ask questions. Thanks, Andrea.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Andrea. Yes, it's a great pleasure being here with academic children and grandchildren. In fact, it's a great pleasure, and lots of friends, etc. So I'll be giving you this conversation. I'm very happy to be back at campus. Last time I was here, it was for a party in honor of Eve in Wilfried Brutzert, very dear friends of mine, and so I'm very happy to be here. So this conversation, it's called Reflected in Water. It is essentially a conversation of what I believe are important issues upcoming in a number of related fields. So we call it ecohydrology, talking about as an excuse to talk about the resilience of communities and inequalities, something I very much care for, essentially. So, no, I'll be back to that. I will make sure that everything is working. So the first picture takes us in Bangladesh, where we did for quite a bit of time field work, in fact, and it is in a sense an important point of reflection today, because this young fellow was trying to convince me that the mighty waters of the Meghna, which on whose banks I was sitting at that point, cannot do any harm. So essentially, the young kid was given for granted that the ecosystem services like drinkable water would have been granted in that place. The only thing which is curious is that this happened like, I work, one of the things of my major, in fact, the reason of field work was the study of waterborne disease. And like 200 meters upstream of this place, there is one of the largest hospitals in the world dedicated to diarrheal diseases. It's next to Dhaka, and the center that does is one of the most specialized. By the way, cholera, which the disease I was studying here, evolutionarily speaking, was originated in that area. Now what happens is that you catch cholera if you ingest a number of pathogens, vibrions in fact, which the threshold for catching the infection, in fact, depends on the body size, it depends on the health of the person, etc. But essentially it's related to the fact that you have to ingest a certain concentration of pathogens. And the point is humbling. Why? Because the very simple question, will the guy catch cholera, is absolutely impossible to answer. because it's fraught with so much uncertainty, because you have to characterize a point-wise concentration in time, in a specific instant of time, in a specific point in place, etc. In a place in which you have uncertainty over the initial conditions, the boundary conditions of the process. For instance, you don't know how leaky the sewers of a hospital 200 meters away are, and you literally know nothing about what's going to happen in the little 200 meters of a survival of a river in the free environment. So the main idea is that what we have to realize is that a permanent liability on our ability to put a price tag on ecosystem services has been completely haunting us for years. And this image instead takes us to Burkina Faso, where, and not that it's a good also, it's a good point to acknowledge Mark Ballange, then my dean, who started the fieldwork which I took over when he transferred to Columbia University, and in Sub-Saharan Africa, which it was devoted to study of a different type. But this is also a paradigm for what we could hope in the future. The kind of questions that we ask are, will future large-scale water resources management plans take into account the reduction of biodiversity loss? Because we do have hopes that this might happen. Is by any chance the shape of the river network, which, as you see, it be a template for the spread of deadly or debilitating waterborne disease? Because the answer is again yes, what we know now. Or how about biological invasions? Are biological invasions what predictable? Even the very structure of a river network, biological invasions, including the Neolithic transitions that shape the communities, the human communities you see them today. And all these blended, in fact, now, why this is interesting? Because in a sense, the idea that the fact that we cannot put the price tag on ecosystem services is the reason why we have a very, very important issue with policy analysis. In this case, for instance, a bunch of guys we know from the Swiss Tropical Institute, in fact, run a meta-analysis, in fact, of schistosomiasis, which is the disease bilharziose, if you want, which is a debilitating disease. It's not deadly, but has particular features, in fact. And waterborne development proved to be very much linked. It is what you see here. This is the same small dam that you saw in the picture before. Systematic reviews and meta-analysis and the estimating people show that there is an obvious, clear correlation between the 15,000 small dams that were financed by the World Bank in this area to prompt to foster and to boost the agriculture in the area. And what is very clear is that the same regions in which you created very powerful and lengthy irrigation networks had two effects. One effect was that to expand significantly the ecological range of the pathogen, the intermediate host for the closure of the cycle, which is a particular freshwater snail of the genus Mulinus, in fact, which you can calculate on the basis even of hydrologic parameters, etc. And the second one, the capillary network for irrigation, in fact, shortened dramatically the average distance between the households, the average household, and the water body. So essentially, you have to keep guys to touch the water, because you catch the disease by simply, because there's a skin penetration, it's a flatworm, in fact, but in a certain stage of the life cycle, it gets into your skin, and you get the disease. What is bad about that? It is a poverty reinforcing and learning impairing disease, which doesn't, you can clean it up by getting praziquantel, for instance, but it doesn't give any acquired immunity. So as a result, the effect is that this is essentially something that's going to have to stick in. You had that incidences of the order of 90%, in fact, of children below a certain age were shown in the place in which the incidence was 0 before. So will we be able in the future to prevent water development schemes like these? Because obviously the GDP of Burkina Faso was boosted by the 15,000 small dams, etc. But you never put the cost, in fact, of a disease, of a learning impairment that it has generated, and all the consequences. These are the kind of questions that we plan to do today. And this introduces us to, in fact, to modern environmental economics, so I very much I'm very much curious on seeing. What you see here is Partha Dasgupta from Cambridge University and Simon Levine from Princeton University, EPFL, by the way. And the idea is more or less trivialized as follows. It is, if the community decides to drain a mangrove swamp to make way for a commercial center, what you would see in the GDP of that area in the future will be clearly boosted by the employment, by the whatever, the value of the place, etc. Because you put never into account, in fact, the ecosystem services you lose forever. So the general idea that we have in this sense is that no economy can thrive forever. It can thrive only forever by mining natural capital, by destroying soils, by decimating forests, by depleting renewable and non-renewable sources, by slashing biodiversity. And the point is that the fact is the following: if you don't take into account the natural capital, economic indicators that do not include the measure, a quantitative assessment of a natural capital, don't give you a fair perspective of a poverty of the riches of nations, to dub, if you want, Landis rather than Adam Smith. And that's a point of our reflection, because the fact that our liability I was talking to you about at the beginning of the talk is precisely the reason why we haven't been convincing anyone. And I'm trying to tell you about success stories in which networks are involved. That's what we've been doing in Ecohydrology for quite some time. This is a network in which you have a nice, in fact, a nice superposition of a built environment and a natural environment, as you see it here. Now, enter the curse of so-called Kuznets curves. You can see more or less, yes. Kuznets was an economist, a Harvard professor, escaped from the Nazi Germany, in fact, which generated those curves, more or less trivialized or somewhat dignified that they were exposed. Something in which it was done based on empirical evidence was reached after the recovery of the societies after the Second World War. And what you have in these diagrams is that if you look like income per capita on the abscissa and the inequalities on the other, somehow simplifying, but that's their message. The very idea was that you would observe in the initial phase of the recovery, we have inequalities increase, followed by a fact in when income per capita would just increase more or less, more afterwards, what you would have is that inequalities would decrease. Enter this guy, he's called Thomas Piketty, with this very boring book called The Capital in the 21st Century, whose the initial 30 pages are absolutely breathtaking, in fact. And it turns out to be false. It is essentially the message that motivated development thinking stacked against nature and stacked against environmental thinking was under the spell of the fact that, okay, let's get richer on average and inequalities will decrease. It is false. That what Piketty did was analyzing the system and realizing very clearly that it wasn't that Kuznets curves or Kuznets results were wrong, but they were right after the recovery of a major disruption like the Second World War. And by the way, our generation thought that famine, epidemics, pandemics, and wars would have been spared for us forever. We got all of them, including famine nowadays, which is interesting. But the idea is that if you restudy, if you do the analytical, if you run the exercises, you see that it is false. With increasing richness, individual and global, inequalities will decrease. And in fact, there's a nice, I'm not making technical observations unless for details, but if you assume that, in reality, you assume that wealth per capita is distributed like a power law, there's empirical evidence today, but that's not the subject of the talk today. We can discuss forever what is a straight line in a log-log plot, was the subject of very interesting statistical and theoretical physicist debates in the past. But this is a reasonable approximation on what we see in nature. And what happens is we can run the exercise very clearly. And what happens is that it's a self-organized process that is pertaining to open dissipative systems with many degrees of freedom to have the same outcome. And the result is that with the empirical exponent that you have, for instance, in the richness for the US, you get 80% of the wealth is in the hands of the 20% richest fraction of the population. So inequalities grow without bounds. And why hydrology and why ecohydrology gets into the picture? Well, we have fantastic data. If you take pictures taken from Google Maps, you start filtering the vegetation, in fact, or you can go and extract, filtering out the vegetation. You would have like that with LIDAR or LiDAR maps, if you want to, and we started studying them like 35 years ago by now. What you have is that you have an exquisite description of landscapes from which you can extract, assuming that gravity is the main ingredient, to extract river networks, to the point that what you see here, you think it's a picture, and it's not. It's a digital terrain map in which you essentially have color coding that reminds you what you see there. And what is differentiating, and that's why you've had hydrology at the time got into big debate about self-organization, perbac and the likes, about which I'll talk, however, briefly. It's just because we can cover in some places phenomena in which you have, of course, ground truthing easy to be made, clearly up to 6 orders of magnitude in scale. No astrophysical data, in fact, is this precise, in fact, this verifiable and covering this large range of scales. So these things is that river networks got at the center of our attention in the beginning because we wanted to study open dissipative systems with many degrees of freedom, but rather than doing everything completely different every time, they run into the same shapes inevitably. And the reason is that if you take out a scale bar from a map of the river, you cannot tell whether this is like one of those gorgeous suppliers here or the Amazon. You cannot, on statistical grounds. And that's something which this is interesting, because then from those pictures I'm kind of trivializing it, but you can actually have remotely acquired and objectively manipulated, you can have effectively drainage directions, which is something which goes at the heart of the main state variables that characterize these systems over like easily 4 orders of magnitude, quite likely more than that. And the idea is that, so if you assume that in a simple conformation you get this, which is called the connectivity matrix, that is something which is telling you the drainage direction which you're going by steepest descent, for instance. And so you can calculate at every point the master variable for geomorphology, in fact, for catchment hydrology, which is total contributing area at the point. It is essentially, you get parachuted in the place, you have an idea on the amount of drainage that you have here on the back, how many nodes are connected to yourself. And the picture is something like that. What is interesting, all those signatures of self-organized critical systems, that is the power law distribution, and they strive to get scale-free distributions. It's the norm, and it's universality of form that you see in the river networks, which is behind the thing I was telling you, loosely speaking, earlier on. That is the fact that essentially what you have, if you wipe out the scale bar, you cannot tell whether a map is of a small river or a gigantic river, in fact, which of course has lots of even philosophical implications. It's a good time also, Eve, to talk about a great friend whom passed away a couple of years ago, in Nassau too, but then at Princeton University, and then at Texas A&M, who was the master of recognizing that the universality of form, in fact, what you observe in nature, regardless of initial conditions, regarding of geological substrate, regarding of vegetation, climate, you name it, you're going to have river networks with recognizable statistical features, which are in fact universal. And then you pop in 2 other ingredients. One is Benoit Mandelbrot and Per Bach, all of them dead, by the way, and all of them used to be friends. In particular, Per Bach died at age 52. The fathers of fractals in one case, and of self-organized criticality on the other. Most important is that what Mandelbrot, despite certain criticism that came from quarters of snobbish mathematicians, and I'm an engineer, and so was Mandelbrot, in fact. That's why he was kind of discussed. But without him, we wouldn't be talking about the fact that mountains are no cones, clouds are not spheres, nor coastline are simple broken lines, in fact, because nature, the mathematical language that describes how nature is seen, remained obscure after Euclid for more than 2,000 years. That's in fact the geometry of nature and that. And Per Bach was in fact talking about the self-organized characters, those that grant that particular robustness. So the main message is that until, say, the end of last century, there was a whole body of work that showed this universality of form. What starts in this century, in fact, in the last 24 years, I would say, is how this universality of form oozes on the universality of behavior, of, in particular, river networks as ecological corridors. And the main point I mean to tell you is that this gives a kind of robustness that allows us to put a price tag on ecosystem services. So the exercise I'm going to show you is the following. Suppose you have two different systems. Okay, now I'm talking about a very abstract model called the neutral model of biodiversity, in fact, but with the same, well, only one difference. In one case, you have directional dispersal induced by the fact that your neighbor is connected to you by a river network. So you have a place like, in this case, your neighbor, this is your neighbor, this is not your neighbor, because it's neighbor physically, but the path that connects you is longer. Whereas in the second case, you have a von Neumann neighborhood. That is, every place has 4 different nearest neighbors. And you can complicate this as much as you want, essentially. So what I'm going to show you is the following. It's an exercise called the voter model that was devised in sociology, in fact, how the psychology of the voter is affected. Let's suppose the colors are like political opinions. And the preposterous assumption of the neutral model is the fact that no political opinion is stronger than any other. So essentially, the game runs as follows. So you got distribution of colors, of opinions, and you kill one, and you replace one with probability, say, 10 to the minus 5. You replace it with a new political opinion, coming from nowhere, different from any other. In most other cases, you simply take the most abundant of your nearest neighbors. By the way, it could be nearest neighbors or a kernel, if you look at the ecological language, in fact, which is a certain distance, or a mean field, that is on the entire thing. So essentially, you get the most numerous of the political opinions. There's no stronger political opinion than any other. The only difference in the two is simply the number of who's your neighbor, essentially. Whether it's the nearest neighbor, like in von Neumann's, or it is dictated by the direction of dispersal. Now, the second thing, the first thing that you want to see is that the gamma diversity, total number of species, what happens is the system with the network is more protected. In the end, you have more species that survive because of the natural enclaves of protection that are generated by the source areas. And the second thing, it doesn't take a sophisticated statistician to realize the two things are different, in fact. And this difference oozes on a particular phase. What is interesting, and nobody believed in that, because there was Simon Levine and Ignacio Rodriguez were more than that, but because of a neutral assumption. The neutral assumption in ecology and in biology is preposterous. It's assuming that per capita rates are equal, regardless of size. An elephant and an ant would have the same biological rates. See, so this is completely abstract, etc. The only reason why we use this neutral model at length is because it's analytically tractable in statistical mechanics. That's why it makes it a powerful condition for us. So we decided to take to the lab. We taught ourselves ahead of the wonderful work that Professor Andrea is doing now at Cornell. We started with very rudimentary tools, etc., but proper replication, a system in which we simply put a test, a system which was nothing neutral, 21 species of protists into wells, and directional dispersal done manually by brute force by graduate students. He's in fact ancestor Francisco Carrales. So we did the experiment, which was nothing neutral. And believe it or not, the results are exactly the results that you get from the neutral model. Although there's nothing neutral in the infinitely small that you have in the replication of the well plates in this case. However, rudimentary the techniques we use were, but directional dispersal does manually, in fact, in this case. What happens is that you do have more biodiversity in a system in which, again, there's nothing neutral. And the message which later on was agreed, not enough to vindicate, in fact, the inventor of a neutral model applied not to genetics, but to ecology, in fact. But the idea is that in this case, what you have, you reproduce the diversity that you have in a network system, which is lost in a system which is more connected, in fact. And this is the first character, robustness, that you have it in the infinitely small. Now, what is also interesting is that this connects to something analytical quite important. This guy, Ilka Hansky, a great ecologist, in fact, which had these meta-population studies in which he would make another preposterous assumption. The one in which you assume that interspecific interactions of species do not exist. So the main mechanism that shape the propagation of species into a system would simply be like the colonization rate, the extinction rate, and the dispersal capacity of a species. And what happens is that, interesting in that, I will return to that, because you have like one number, you go back to dominant eigenvalues analysis, you can calculate the onset of instability of an extinction rate. And what is interesting then, from the infinitely small, you carry out to the infinitely big. Now, you apply the same model that you have seen, in fact, for the Volta model, you apply to the Mississippi-Missouri system. So from something which is completely abstract to something which is in a replicated well plates to thousands of kilometers, tens of thousands of kilometers. And what you're having here, these are the data you rely on. In this case, LSR is local species diversity. There's a fantastic data set on fish that Bill Fagan, the co-author of the work, put together in there, and you get the different color codes, the number of species you have in different places. And down you have this very sophisticated measure, AARP, annual average runoff production. Music to the ears of hydrologists. But obviously there is a correlation between the two. And what is absolutely surprising is that neutral pattern does not require neutral process. The pattern that you get through the neutral system, which you can characterize even analytical, etc., gives you a portrait which is fantastic in seeing what happens, in fact, in your system. And what happens is that you can reproduce alpha diversity along the main stem of Mississippi, Missouri, reproducing data in a marvelous manner with a model which is nothing but the neutral model you have seen. So you gain confidence on the fact that you can actually look and get a value of ecosystem services, because this is a robust determination, in fact, that you have. So it goes to species. I'm going to show you now populations and then pathogens. And populations means you have to go on the giants of the field, Fisher and Kolmogorov, in fact. There's an idea that in a system in which you do have a one-dimensional system, in which you have like reproduction according to a logistic curve and some diffusion, this will develop into a solid tone in which the speed of a traveling wave can be perfectly characterized. And the infinitely large can be done. This is invasion of the zebra mussel in Mississippi and Missouri River Basin, in fact, something quite interesting, because you can predict very nicely what happens, even with something which becomes jargon, modern jargon, like multiplex networks. Why? Because you will see that, for instance, the zebra mussel, a great competitor, will just start diffusing down and creating havoc, in fact, in the Mississippi, Missouri. And all of a sudden, 1,000 kilometers away, this thing which was never seen before, by the way, it was brought by Ukrainian cargo ships, and it was in the ballast water that was dumped next to the exit of the Chicago Canal. So how the alligators that the spores got into the system and started thriving in there. What is interesting in this case, in some cases you would see that 1,000 kilometers away, you would have that boom, like forest fires, you get the bush of infections very far away. Why? What happened? People would take the boats used for recreation in the place of the Mississippi River, don't clean it well, put it on the tug, you bring it like 1,000 kilometers away, put it in the water. That's how, in fact, propagation, in fact, is ended. And that's why, in fact, Homo sapiens got more or less anywhere a suitable place. And that's what comments to Professor Giometto, who did that and studied the effect of this on the infinitely small, getting very interesting results, very similar results in looking how, in fact, you would have and then he learned wonderfully well how to set up a wet lab, and now his lab here that I visited yesterday and today, it's absolutely marvelous. But again, the message is, even biological invasions, you breach the infinitely small and infinitely large, and you get compelling evaluation of the ecosystem services you need to have, the precondition to put a price tag on the ecosystem services. And the last thing I'm telling you, in fact, is going to be something which devoted much work, because essentially the ecosystem services we care for regard how, in fact, you can slash or else foster species, populations, or pathogens of waterborne disease. In fact, that's one of the things that we're doing. So if you look at systems, which is like in this case where nodes are human communities where disease spreads, in fact, and you have models of a kind that you can use in a very general thing, that they have a very distinguished functional analysis and their counterpart, numerics if you want, and theoretical results. In terms of the so-called susceptible infected and recovered model, SIR, which are important. So the demography of a disease in a context which is now spatially explicit, because mind you, in a SIR model, you have, in the case of cholera, or in SIR, you have 3 coupled ODEs. If you have n nodes in which you have a possibility of studying the demography of the disease, connected by mobility, because exactly since medieval times we know that human mobility is what propagates the infection. If you have n nodes, you have 3n times 3n, in fact, matrices which you have in the system. And we took it to the field. I personally went 3 times in Haiti after November 2010, when a disastrous outbreak of cholera was planted by us, north of the world, by the way. UN peacekeeping forces that were sent to Haiti because in trying to control the looting in a place in which a disastrous earthquake in the poorest country in the world had killed 300,000 and destroyed whatever infrastructure was left in that place. There's no roads, there is no water distribution systems, there are no sewer systems, there's no police, there's nothing in Haiti in there. And this is what we have been seeing in the place. And if you just simply take what was available worldwide since the beginning, it was essentially the number of confirmed cases, confirmed, not super accurate, but essentially you have these tools that have a certain features that you can generate by eyeball, and you have them daily. And if you take a simple measure against simple things first, you take the total number of reported cases of cholera in Haiti in the first few months of the disease. And what you see in there, this is simply total reported cholera cases in the place. What you see in there is the reverse, in fact. So the idea that in a sense, that universality of form that we had explored earlier, in fact, shows up into universality of function as ecological correlates for viability for disease. So you go back to tools which are typical of the engineers, like altitude maps, digital terrain maps, if a network is structured properly, population maps you can get anywhere, mobility networks which can be either modeled or tracked by cell phones, and the result is this one. By the way, there's also some quite fine, in fact, functional analysis in this space. This is Marino Gatto, one of the best theoretical ecologists. Simply the idea that the dominant eigenvalue analysis that Ilka Hansky established for metapopulations, and that's for species, in fact, it means you that in the spirit of what we call the next generation matrices that you have in the place, essentially. So essentially, you have to go to see where there's an exchange of stability, because in this case, what you have, essentially, you can calculate Jacobians in a spatially explicit system. Now, because these are positive matrices, you can calculate analytically the blocks of the various things. They're called Metzler matrices. You can calculate Jacobians exactly, so you can calculate exact results. Numerically, you can do wonders, in fact. And the idea there is a dominant eigenvalue, which is in this case, it expresses the condition for the stability of disease-free equilibrium. In fact, this is the onset of disease. The eigenvectors associated with that show you the path that you have. So long story short, now we have tools that are more than enough to get to, for instance, evaluating alternatives in managing, in fact, outbreaks in this case, because they are not perfect, but certainly are very, very close, in fact. And what is that character that gives that robustness is indeed the structure of a remote network. And I'm flying to my conclusions, because that's also a picture which I took in Haiti during the height of the disease, etc. It was something which is really disturbing to me. But it's something which really disturbs me, talking about inequalities, and is the fact that in places like Haiti, access to safe water is socially biased, but the ownership of a cell phone is not. This young lady in this Carrefour, you see, but you can imagine how dilapidated the place is, in fact. In Carrefour, this lady with the red dress, in a second after I turned down the camera, because, you know, it was in one of those cars in which with a glass that couldn't be shot by anyone, etc., because they could kill you. In fact, they had to steal your camera. In 1 second, that lady showed a Nokia N900 to the lady that you see in here, selling cabbages, showing the app, and got the cabbage in return. there's something funny, in the fact that in the south of the world, wherever you go to the entire Africa, wherever you want, in any possible place, you will see that ownership of a cell phone is not socially biased. And what happens is that the north of the world is planting all the infrastructure that you have in that place to generate the need for that structure, which is a good thing, etc. But without pretending that other essential infrastructures, talking about inequalities, like safe water distribution networks, for instance, are in there. And there's something which, this is why exactly we're not credible, we north, the global north, we're not credible with the global south, when we're talking about mitigation, that is the real solution of the climate crisis, in fact. Well, that's a different story. So I'm coming to my conclusion, and the conclusion is I'm relatively in time, sort of. And my conclusion is that when the Stockholm Water Prize 2023 was announced, they told me that, look, essentially the prize gives you a megaphone that the world will listen. What is the message you want to leave? And the message, which I thought for a sizable amount of time, and I decided that for me, the message is that time is right to rethink distributive justice in the water resources distribution. And means floods, means droughts, means a fair distribution of water. As a tool for reducing inequalities on a global scale, which in the end, something which you see here, like you see anywhere, gradients in welfare are the drivers of migrations on a global scale. And this has to change. Time is right to change. And what you see in here, you can certainly have quantitative evaluations when at least they're reflected in quotas. Thank you.
All right, we have time for a few questions.
A very short one. Everything you present is fantastic. You know, the understanding you gained out of your studies. But can you indeed change the future as a result of it?
I doubt it, but certainly, when I'm saying that time is ripe to rethinking, it doesn't mean that we'll be able to do that. But the idea is that we should be loud about the fact, but we have the tools now for realizing that. For instance, now this ownership of a cell phone means that you can track, in fact, population on a big data type of thing, etc. So you can actually control in real time epidemics to evolve. There's a significant thing, etc. But for instance, to me, what happens is that, in a nutshell, Eve, I think the real idea is that I do believe that there has to be the market. We have to respect the market moving, the infrastructure to getting the phone going, but there has to be a public hand that controls. I think it's very much so. And that's the perspective. The second thing, which is in reality, that's because we're not credible with the global south, because we've been destroying our own resources and they are only large part. Now we pretend for mitigation, for reducing the greenhouse concentrations, that they obey to us and they give up some hard gain improvements in the quality of their life. It will not work. So I'm pessimistic. What I'm saying is that, look, guys, we know how to. Not everywhere, etc. Not the entire biodiversity belongs in the river basin, but certainly a large part does. Let's begin from some place. In this case, we know how to do that.
When COVID hit, many of these tools were available and had been developed. What have we learned from COVID, like in terms of accessibility of mobility data, for example, or other data that we're missing, or human behavior? How good were we at predicting it?
Well, even now, because for privacy, they don't give you the big data on the human mobility, because theoretically you could be able to pinpoint individual trajectories to see if there's someone cheating his wife or to some places. In reality, it was a commercial factor. They didn't want their in fact, now the GPS is mounted on every single cell phone in that case. But for instance, it was during the other lesson that comes from COVID is that we're not being spared pandemics, we're not being spared famines because of a war. For instance, the Ukrainian cargoes that got stuck in Crimea, in fact, because of a war, had as a result that MENA countries, Middle East and Northern Africa countries, didn't have grain, in fact. And so you have all these, we haven't been spared. Famine, wars, pandemics, etc. So that's what the COVID left as a streak, is that we have to rethink literally what we thought it was going forever. We have to go back to the drawing board. And to begin with, my take, of course I'm biased, everybody sees the disease is curing, right? What I'm saying is that we should start from the fair distribution of water. Because in Italy, for instance, we just cicadas, in fact, in my country. The average is one of the highest in Europe. We consume something like 300 liters per day per person. And in sub-Saharan Africa, the dotation is what a woman typically can bring on her head, maybe walking a mile to get to a filthy well, which you had like a phreatic aquifer or something like that. Interesting pictures of that. That's the differences in inequality. Reducing inequalities, meaning making infrastructure for having safe water, will reduce immigration for sure. It's not simply whether, and for instance, water sits at the center of meta history, the availability of water. We have to think.
We have a question on Zoom.
Yes.
If you go on the chat, I can help you out.
Okay.
Do you think condensation-based water technologies have potential to provide decentralized water access in rural regions without creating large-scale water projects?
They could. It's a good question. It could help, Christina. It could help for sure. But what I'm saying here, the rethinking, again, if you make an example, things are not well. I mean, thinking, for instance, the way you manage the access of water. You know, I've been focusing in this case on certain ecosystem services, but you look at how we work in hydrology is floods, droughts, and the fair distribution of water. We're only talking about fair distribution of water because I care about it, etc. But talking about floods, when there's an inescapable physical law called Clapeyron's law that ends for every degree more of air temperature, atmospheric temperature, that atmosphere takes from 6 to 8% more water vapor holding in it. When you face a cold front, what you're going to have? You have a water bombs, as they call them, right? It's going to be more intense rainfall. You can actually show that about droughts, floods and droughts are linked through Clapeyron and two coins of the same metal, in fact. So in a system in which you have those hockey stick diagrams of any social economic indicators or measure of a perturbation of biosphere, they are all hockey stick-like. This is from the beginning of the 18th century, the first of years of the 18th century, to 1950s of the 20th century, a flat, like wide Holocene, started growing without bounds after that. They're called hockey stick diagrams, in fact. That's the issue. We haven't been able to reduce the concentration of greenhouse gases. So, in fact, condensation-based technologies could help. There's a hell of a lot. Nature-based solutions, remember there is a rainforest, there is a fog forest, there's a hell of a lot that we can learn, etc. But in reality, I think a real solution, mitigation, will only come when the north and the south of the world meet. That's the essence of a reflection. And that now is difficult in my view. I believe that therefore we're only left with coping with the things here.
So you're arguing for reducing the gradient, not the diffusivity across the border?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm very much advocating for that. I think it's only prudent to assume that mitigation will be gone. If it does, fantastic. If a physicist finally are able to produce the fusion they've been promising for 50 plus years, might be more than welcome. But I think it's safe to assume that the old engineer that shows it makes sense to assume that this will not happen. And it's essentially the most important rule of engineering, it's Murphy's law, right? Something bad can happen, it will happen, in fact. And I believe that's how it should be prepared.
Yeah, we see this with, as we look at stormwater systems for looking at reducing flood risk. If the objective function is risk, which is the probability of the event times the loss, you skew your investments towards wealthy neighborhoods.
Yeah.
So even locally, not just north and south. So then you have to rethink the objective function.
And in there is an embedded, in fact, inequality in there, because if you look, because of Clapeyron's law, because of the changing climate change, they would be more likely, the small and medium-sized rivers that would generate the most dramatic, like I said, because the bigger one for simple probability statements will be less exposed. The idea that we have to think of meta-statistics
Italian law says that floods, we have to be protected against a freeboard of 1 meter with a 200-year flood. What is a 200-year flood in a rapidly changing world? Distribution is not stationary. We have evidence that distribution is not stationary. And quoting a famous philosopher, the future is not what it used to be. It was a baseball player. Well, Yogi Berra, if you want, there's an ancestor in a French, Paul Vidal, who was a philosopher and poet in France. I said it earlier. And I doubt that Yogi Berra knew what he was quoting. But that's the point. The fact that things are in March require an extra attention. Rethinking is important. Reducing the gradients is reducing inequalities. Very much convinced.
Good. Then, since Andrea has to take a flight, I think we can we can close it here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.